Grief is not a problem that needs fixing, period. It is a normal response to loss. So when I talk about my little grief support slogan is show up, shut up, and listen and keep showing up. That's all you need to know. You're not showing up to fix. You're showing up to hold space and to bear witness, to help the griever carry the weight of grief for a while. That's it.
This is the Buried in Work podcast, where we share tips and interview experts to help you simplify estate planning and end-of-life tasks.
I'm your host, Adam Zuckerman, and today we are joined by Lisa Keefauver, a leading grief activist, speaker, author, and podcast host as well. It's great to have somebody that's been on the other side of the mic, so this is going to be a fun conversation. Lisa's personal and professional experiences with loss have led her to dedicate her life to reimagining grief and offering compassionate guidance for individuals and organizations. Lisa, it's an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much. As I was saying earlier off the air, I love this. It's my favorite conversation, favorite topic. So here we go.
All right, well, let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your personal grief journey and how did it inspire you to create Reimagining Grief?
Yeah, so I always joke that I was not a little girl growing up thinking, I want to be a grief activist, because I think 0% of people grow up thinking that that's what they want to do. Though I was called to be a social worker after experiencing some early trauma in my childhood. And it was at that time when I really began to experience my first most profound loss, which was the death of my husband. I was a clinical social worker, trained in narrative therapy, running a nonprofit. My husband was a geographer, athlete, amazing human being. And over the course of the year became completely unrecognizable. And we went from doctor to doctor, asking questions, being told it's just a personality issue and being put on meds and off meds, all the while advocating and railing, knowing that there was something profoundly wrong, that he had become a completely different human being. As I mentioned, I was 40, he was 44. We had a daughter who was 7. And about 16 days before he died in my arms was when they finally decided to run a scan and found out it had been a grapefruit-sized brain tumor that had shifted his brainstem. And the ICU doctor said to us, as we were sitting in the ER when they called him in, when the results came in, I don't understand how you're walking or talking. It's shifted your brainstem. This doesn't make any sense. And as I mentioned, found myself leaving my husband, who died in my arms, in the hospital, and going home and telling my 7-year-old daughter that her dad was dead. And then being recalled to work less than 2 weeks later by my bosses, who were social workers, and having to return to work. And that was an early loss experience that began to plant the seeds to shifting what it is that I knew I was meant to be doing in the world. I experienced some profound losses after that. I was with my friend Joe just a few years later when he passed in my arms as well. But one of the things that I always tell when I have the chance to talk about this story is here I was, so many grievers feel a lot of guilt around how they should do it better, or I should know how to do this. And we, as I say, should all over ourselves. But I feel I had that in triplicate because there I was, the clinical director, the social worker, I had clients, right? I should know how to do this. And I'm using air quotes. I'm realizing nobody can hear us. And that was really the turn, because I returned to work and realized how profoundly our culture, including our helping professions like social workers and psychologists, have an incomplete and incorrect and harmful story of grief and grieving, and how much harm that was causing myself, my daughter, and even my clients as I began to look at them through a new lens of the more expansive way I've come to understand grief. So that was the beginning of my journey. I have a sustained 20-plus year meditation on holding space and bearing witness. That's been key to me, which is critical in grief. But those losses, particularly the loss of my husband and then the loss of my friend, and realizing the world around me did not understand how to show up and hold space and bear witness for that. And I didn't understand what I was going to be navigating all these years. And that led me on this path. I had been a speaker, I'd been a writer, I'd been a narrative therapist and a trainer. So I knew I had these skills to sort of take all of the personal and the professional and show up in the world and do something with it.
Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by the unexpected impact of it? So you've been in this space.
Yeah.
Theoretically, you're probably one of the best positioned people in the country, if not the world, to understand and deal with what was about to happen, but yet you're
Yeah.
still surprised. How come?
Well, again, as I said, I think we are all a result of the culture in which we live. And when we think about the culture in which we live, it's productivity over process and destinations over journeys, right? Stoic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Everything is in a neat and orderly fashion. Everything is sort of instead of both and. And what I recognized quite early on was that this story that we tell in media, in movies and storytelling, but also we have all sort of consumed. And that story is very much of the myth of the 5 stages of grief, that we just move on and that it's just sad feelings. And then eventually we stop feeling sad. And what I came to understand is that we're actually impacted across 5 domains when we experience a profound loss, which I just want to name for your listeners, can happen even not related to a death. We experience grief over all kinds of losses. I think the biggest problematic story that I came to uncover is that we actually experience grief emotionally, cognitively, physically, relationally, and spiritually. Right. And so if we started to unpack that, which I'm happy to explain some of those things, and we know this from science, this isn't just Lisa's theory, is think about the different ways we would build systems in workplaces. Think about the different ways we would show up as friends and family members, as healthcare providers, right? If we understood the longevity of the impact of grief, but also the expansiveness of grief across all the domains of our lives. And that's really when I sort of dug in and thought, I really need to help reimagine grief in this really profound way and start to train people in workplaces, in organizations, work with individuals. Because the suffering, grief is hard. There's no way around that, but there's so much unnecessary suffering. And that happens between the gap of what grief is, our lived experience, and the story we're told about what grief should or shouldn't be or look like or feel like.
And for those that are familiar and those that aren't, the 5 stages that Lisa mentioned, it's the Kubler-Ross model that starts in denial, then anger, then bargaining, then depression, ending in acceptance. And the reality is that it's not always a linear process. You can bounce back and forth, and there is no right or wrong about it.
Yeah. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you might know this already, but maybe it might be interesting to the listeners, did not come up with the 5 stages as a way to think about how we grieve other people. It's actually about how people came to terms with the end of their own lives. And while we do experience some of those things, I think the popularity of the 5 stages is a perfect example of our cultural obsession with top 10 lists and everything that's in a neat and orderly fashion, because that was not what she was purporting, but that's what we glommed onto because, of course, and I say this sort of cheekily, but also like empathetically because I've been there, of course we want a nice, neat order out of the absolute terror and misery and heartache and pain of grief. That would be wonderful. And we cause so much suffering because then we look at ourselves, and when we have an ebb and flow, which is the nature of grief, we say to ourselves, wait, I thought I moved past that stage, right? And then we judge ourselves or other people, by the way, for that. And so, yeah, just to name that, that's just such a perfect example of the way grief culture in our country has been impacted by our broader culture and why we really need to get curious about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's not just that. I mean, it's commonplace in all industries. And the 3-step problems, the 3-step approaches, and Kettering Health has choose, connect, and communicate. Like that's going to fix everything.
Yeah.
And that even implies that things are broken and need to be fixed in a strange way. So,
right. Exactly.
With all of that context, you talk about the collective story of grief. Can you help people understand how that applies to them and what they can do to leverage it to make things a little bit easier on themselves?
Yeah. So right now, currently, and when I speak, I sort of speak about the West because I think, there are a lot of cultures that are not as maybe problematic or invalid as I think that story of grief, our collective story of grief in the West goes. But our collective story of grief goes something like, you experience grief when someone you're close to dies. You grieve for a while, maybe a few months. You're sad, maybe angry, but only, limited. And, you hurry up and get back to work because it's good for you. If you must, see a therapist so you don't get your grief on other people. And then you move through the 5 stages in an orderly fashion and voila, right? Like that's the story we have. And I know you know this because you lost your father. I'm sure your listeners know this too. That has absolutely no bearing on our lived experience of grief. So when we hear that as what is acceptable and appropriate and quote unquote normal, then when we are messy, which we are because, by the way, life is messy, as is grief, right? When we feel 65 emotions, not one, including, by the way, anger and anxiety, which, are not as palpable to the world. When we experience profound loss over, a miscarriage, when we experience a profound loss over the end of a relationship, over being laid off. I think about this all the time in the workplace. And we feel all the normal responses to loss, which is what grief is. But the world isn't showing us that that's okay, that that's normal. When we have profound brain fog because there is a real cognitive impact on our grief, all of the truths of our lived experience as individuals don't match that collective story. And that's where the suffering happens. In part, too, because we don't know how to show up for ourselves or ask for help. And other people don't know how or don't even recognize that we need help in this way. And I wanted to reflect something you said, which I think is so important, Adam. Grief is not a problem that needs fixing, period. It is a normal response to loss. So when I talk about my little grief support slogan is show up, shut up, and listen, and keep showing up. That's all you need to know. You're not showing up to fix. You're showing up to hold space and to bear witness, to help the griever carry the weight of grief for a while. That's it. So you don't have to have all your great solutions and fixes because they're not broken. They're just grieving. And actually, we want to be moving through and metabolizing our grief because that's how we get to the place where we can hold both grief and joy.
There's three different people and entities that we've mentioned in a roundabout way. There's the individual who is grieving.
Yeah.
There are those around them that may be interacting with that individual. And then there's the broader circle of where they may work or where the communities that they may operate within. You spent a little bit of time, actually a lot of time, looking at all three of those groups. Can you help the listeners understand the relationship between the three groups?
Yeah. Well, I think we started by touching on a little bit, which is that we as individuals are very much impacted by the collective, that broader collective, and not just what they have to say, by the way, about grief specifically. So I just want to name the reason that the interaction is so important. If you grew up in a family who never mentioned grief, let's say, they never talked about it, but anytime something hard happened, they said, dust yourself off, kid. I don't know who calls that, but whatever. And pick yourself up and move on, right? We had that kind of that bootstrap mentality. If we told people to not show emotions, if we rejected them or shamed them or sent them to their room when they were angry or sad or et cetera, right? If we live in a culture that doesn't recognize same-sex relationships and you're grieving the loss of a same-sex relationship, there's lots of ways in which the broader culture, even when it doesn't touch on the subject of grief per se, teaches us things, again, I'm using air quotes, teaches us things about what grief should or shouldn't look like. So that's that relationship between the collective and the individual. And the relationship means that based on collective ideas about grief or otherwise, you as the individual griever may or may not be seen and validated and affirmed in your grief. You may not be eligible to access services and supports. Maybe your bereavement policy doesn't apply to the death of your best friend, even though they're just as close to you as somebody's spouse is, right? So that's where that collective individual intersection is happening. And then in our smaller community, those same people, I always say this, we don't want to beat up our parents or our friends for not showing up well. They are living in this same grief illiterate culture too. And so that intersection that can happen between the individual and the communities we live in, that might be our family and friends, or it might be our colleagues in our workplace, means they often don't know they've bought the same story. They subscribe to that same collective story. So they think I better not say something because I might upset them, not recognizing that actually we want to talk about our grieving person and that we've never forgotten about them for just 1 minute. They may believe that the best thing that they can help you do is hurry up and move on and stop talking about it and get back to work. Because again, they've participated in this collective story. So often what I say to people is we have to, unfortunately, the burden in some ways is on the griever to identify our own needs and then to ask for them, because the people around us, because they're part of this culture, may or may not know how to show up for us. Because by the way, they never learned how to show up for their own grief or felt seen or supported in their own grief. So there's been a ripple effect across all of those domains in a negative way. And part of the work that I'm trying to do as a grief activist, and I think this show, it's certainly doing this too, is to push back against that. And one person at a time, one grief loss at a time, whether you're the boss who has a chance to make set policies, whether you're in the government and you have a chance to make set policies like these broader bereavement policies, whether you're the individual griever who can have the courage to say to somebody, you know, it really helps me when you just show up and we can tell stories about my person. That would really help me. Then that teaches that person when they go through loss, they can ask for the same thing, and so on and so on.
For those individuals that are in those power positions that can make change for many. And I think that it's wonderful when we focus on the one-to-one relationships and help people in their individual moments. But also if we can do something to change a one-to-many relationship, the boss, the head of HR, that's great too. You've done a lot of work helping communities create those grief-smart workplaces. And I love that term, grief-smart.
Yeah.
Explain what that means, why it's important, and a few tangible steps. So if you're in that position of power, here's a list of 3 things. We'll go back to the lists. Here's a list of 3 things or 5 things that you can tangibly do to make your workplace better for your colleagues.
I think it starts with acknowledging that your workplace would not be successful without humans. I mean, we're not in the era of totally AI yet, although maybe someday somebody unfortunately is going to be able to say that. But I mean, I'm saying that again sort of cheekily, but I think it's true. Your workplace, your organization, the impact that you want to make as an organization is wholly dependent on the humans who are part of your team. And to be human means you will experience grief multiple times in your life. So I think starting with the humanity of our workplace, and I say that because I think, you know, in the modern era, we've really tried to professionalize as if that was equivalent to dehumanizing our workplaces. So I think bringing the humanity back into our workplace and recognizing that humans are showing up to work in grief. It's not an if. Your workplace, listener, has grief in it right now, has grieving employees. Some are more in the acute stages of grief, some are further on, but they're grieving, and they're grieving all kinds of losses. So I think starting with recognizing the humanity, that's a big number one. Everything else is irrelevant if you can't do that. It maybe seems easy, but also I think it's a really profound shift in our culture. I think the second is to take a look at what are your bereavement policies. So many places don't have them, especially if they're not mandated to have them because of the size of their organization. And one of the things I really encourage, and this is maybe pushing for some people, is what is the most expansive definition of bereavement, right? So a lot of places maybe have it for a spouse and maybe or somebody in your sort of nuclear family. But for some of us, our aunt was our parent. For some of us, our best friend was our sole support. Does it cover miscarriage and stillbirth? Does it cover, a natural disaster or devastation of your home or homeland? What are those things? So take a look at your bereavement policy and think about how inclusive is it really? What are the standards by which you're judging that? But policies are necessary, but not sufficient, I think, which gets me to my third, maybe if we're going to just stick with 3 points to this list idea, which is, yes, the policies are great. But if you as the senior staff, if you as the manager, if you as a boss aren't enacting it yourself, are you taking a leave when your spouse, your parent passes? Are you working on a more flexible schedule for some period of time, which is, I think, a really key component of a grief policy, of a bereavement policy, is what kind of adaptable schedules can you come up with? If you're not modeling that yourself, if you're not showing up acknowledging the employee or even acknowledging to the team appropriately, like they're not your therapist, but I'm going through this loss, this is what happened to me, then that is going to set the rule. There's all the policies in the world. We know this. If you have like one of those, you can take all the vacation time in the world you want, but none of the senior staff ever take vacation time.
No one's going to take vacation.
No one's going to take vacation. And the same thing applies to bereavement. It's really about that culture top down. So how are you being honest? How are you being vulnerable? How are you being open? How are you inquiring to your employees? Do the bereavement policies that we have in place actually meet the real lived experience of bereavement? And then go from there. I'm going to pause there. There's a million things you can do with your org, but I think those are some key things to start with. It takes a real courage to self-examine. What are we doing well and what aren't we?
I'm going to put on my capitalist hat and say, this is a
Yeah.
horrible idea. I don't want to give bereavement to any of my employees because I'm not going to be able to fact check to see if their third cousin was truly in their life or if they're trying to
Yeah.
take advantage of the company. What is this? Just a free holiday for all the employees? Is there tangible research that we could then throw back at me and say, no, by doing this, your company, your organization is actually going to perform better? Or is it a subjective measure where, we can,
It's a nice to thing. Yeah.
yeah.
Tons of data and research. I wish I had the deck in front of me. Empathy.com has done a couple of series of research over the years looking at the cost to workplaces by people leaving and quitting, not coming back. The cost, because as I said before, we have a cognitive impact, increase in accidents and injuries and mistakes because cognitive grief brain is a real thing. We also have like high turnover, which we know costs companies money. It takes a lot more money to turn over an employee than it does to keep an employee, right? So like at the financial level, we know, and the cost risk level, we know the data is there. Empathy.com, I think their latest study was in, 2023, maybe even this year of 2024. So the data is there and it's pretty staggering. Companies lose billions and billions of dollars from not providing appropriate relief. You would think it would be by appropriate leave. So besides being, of course, a good thing to do, a human thing to do, financially, it's beneficial for the company. I would also push back because I have heard this directly from a senior staff one time when I was called into a company, to your point about how do I know it's really, and my pushback is you have a bigger problem in your company if you don't trust your employees. If your first assumption is that your employees, or a particular employee, but I would say this one was saying
employee.
general employees, are going to abuse your bereavement policy by lying about a loss, you have much bigger problems in your company. That is
Agreed.
like the least of your problems. So I would say yes. And we know that the more organizations support their employees, whether it's allowing them to come back part-time, temp, adjusting the workload, just even having some paid bereavement leave, employees are much more loyal. They're much more likely to retain, to want to work for that company, to stay. And again, we know both in terms of productivity of the company, but also the financials, that that's good for the company too. So there's kind of no loss really to having a profound, inclusive, and comprehensive bereavement policy because it does all of those things, right? Increases that loyalty, that retention, the capacity of the employee in the organization, and it decreases all of the risks that we might face when we're forcing people to return to work when they're not ready.
And I think that is an excellent, excellent point, that the pushback of you need to focus on other things if that's your biggest concern. So many cultures are broken, and this is just one small piece of that larger puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. It doesn't matter where you're working. If you're the head of, a local Chick-fil-A, or you're the head of Google, if you don't trust your employees to want to be there, to want to show up and do the work, then there's a bigger problem afoot. What is happening in the culture of the organization that is making you suspicious, and or what is your own baggage, by the way? And a lot of times leaders never felt like because they grew up in organizations where their bosses never gave them the social cultural permission to walk through whatever loss they face. And unfortunately, this is where we see the ripple. We see it in families, but we see it in organizations. This is where we see the intergenerational or, impact of poor grief culture and grief illiterate, in particular, in this case, workplaces, because that boss is saying, especially if they're like, Gen X like me or older, well, I never got to, I went through X, Y, and Z, and my boss didn't give a heck about what was going on for me. And I think what happens is when we don't know how to show up for our own grief, or we don't feel seen or held in ours, personally or professionally, by the way, we then enact that on the people who come after us. And that's how we get stuck, which is why I say it really just takes one boss, one friend, one counselor, somebody to see you and acknowledge you and affirm your grief exactly as it is, to shift that ripple effect in a more positive way. That's why I feel optimistic about the work that I do.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you on today and to learn from you is because I love puns and fun approaches to solving things. I mean, buried in work, it's a pun.
Yeah.
Our
Yep.
logo is actually a coffin if you look at it in a weird way. Most people don't recognize that. And you have probably one of the most lighthearted, fun brands around your activism, which is Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, which is just amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Some topics, while very, very serious, can also be approached with a bit of levity.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your podcast, about your book that you have, about all the amazing things that you're doing with Grief is a Sneaky Bitch? And I'm just going to say that again because I like the word.
I like to
Yeah.
do this whenever I give talks somewhere like keynotes. I'm like, let's count how many times I say the word bitch in the talk.
Yeah.
I make a little game of it. Yeah. Well, grief is a sneaky bitch. And one of the things that I don't know how to show up in the world except as myself. And I am somebody who does love a judicious use of cussing from time to time. I do know there's research out there that it is therapeutically valuable. So I'll just say that in defense of it. But also, I think what I'm trying to do with this maybe charged title, it was first my podcast, which I started in 2019. I'm launching my 6th season right now, and is the name of my book as well, is that I'm trying to sort of do a double message here, which is grief is inherently sneaky. That's the whole point. We have this culture that it's neat and tidy, but grief is sneaky because it comes in waves. It can be burst on by a song or by a season or by certainly an anniversary of a loss, by new losses, or actually, by the way, new joys. When I launched my book, the first thing I wanted to do was tell my late husband, right? And then came a grief wave. So grief is inherently sneaky and inherently a sneaky bitch. But part of what I'm trying to do with all of my work is make it less sneaky. The reason it feels so sneaky to so many of us is to what we were talking about before, which is that gulf between the story we have about what we think grief should look like and feel like and the story of what it actually is. So that's where, and that came from me saying that to a friend when I burst into tears at a party a few years after my husband died, and was at a party and actually having fun for the first time in years, and reached in my purse and found a picture of my late husband and burst into tears in a room full of strangers. And my friend pulled me aside and I just said, grief is such a sneaky bitch. And see, we just sort of nodded at each other, and then that was that. So the work that I'm doing, whether it's through the podcast interviewing guests, through the book, which is really a comprehensive companion guide to grievers, in workplaces, keynoting, working with individuals, other media projects that I have going on. It's that theme right across the board. Number one, my goal, because I think it's the first line of defense for all of us who are struggling with grief, is I'm showing up everywhere I can, holding space and bearing witness. I am seeing you and hearing you and holding you in my heart exactly as you are, even in the feeling of your brokenness. And that seems so light and maybe a little non-scientific, but we know it's from that place that any trauma or any wound can have the courage to do that metabolizing, to take that, have the courage to start close in and take that next step. So that's sort of the baseline. But then I'm also out there, my TED Talk did the same thing. It's called Why Knowing More About Grief Can Make It Suck Less. You can tell I love a cheeky title as well. But the same thing, which is I'm trying to tear down all the myths that we have that are causing us unnecessary suffering and put back in place the more invitational language, the more this is how you might experience it language, the comprehensive understanding of it, to give people the tools to, as I said, because in the beginning, we live in a toxic positivity culture that wants everybody to just be happy. And that feels too far a reach for most of us. So again, one of the things that I do in my work is just say, like, what's one thing you can do starting close in that can help it suck less? Like maybe our goal for now, and your listener, if you're early in grief, is having a minute of ease, an hour of ease, right? Maybe that's our goal, and to start close in. So that's the thread of the work that I do. And finally, I'll just say in the workplaces that I go into, I'm doing psychoeducation for sure. I'm doing consulting on how we might structure our policies and, more important, our culture. But the same rules apply in the workplace that they do out of the workplace. And it's really about how do we show up as a boss, as a friend, as a pastor, as a rabbi, as your neighbor. Yeah, how do we show up? And that's the work I'm doing with Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. Yeah.
In the TED Talk that you gave, you opened up with a narrative about the manuscript going,
Yeah.
missing, getting torn up.
Yeah.
A lot of times we talk about how the Clear Kit that we have, it saves people from going on a scavenger hunt. Like if you came over to cook dinner and all the recipes were on the counter and then the ingredients were there, it's going to be an easy night. But if you have to figure out that the rice is in the closet behind a shoebox and you didn't know that, it's going to take you a little bit longer.
Right.
What is that place? Is it your website? Is it somewhere else that people can go to find the instructions, to find the manuscript before it's missing, before it's torn up, so they can contact you and get in touch? Where do they go?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely just show up at my website. I'd say the best thing to do is sign up for my newsletter, because that's where you'll get to know all the things that are happening, the resources. So it's just my name, lisakeefauver.com. But I think if you're somebody this is the experience I've had since the book came out in June. I've had the fortune of traveling the country and speaking in bookstores and big events, is that whether you're the griever or you're somebody who's the colleague or the grief supporter, most people are buying 2 or 3 copies of the book, which of course is a book. My book makes my bookseller very happy, my publisher.
Yeah.
But I really think it's the most, and I've read all the grief books because people come on my show, so I read all the grief books, and there are amazing books out there. But I think a great place to start to figure out, how do you as a griever find your way into this emerging story of your life in the wake of loss? Or how do you as a grief supporter accompany somebody? I think the book was my attempt at taking everything I've learned over the last 2 decades, professionally and personally, through the podcast, all my work, and putting it in a really easy to use guide that you can drop in on. So I think the book, which is available, I always say, please go to your independent bookstore, because I love them so much and I want them to be in business. Or you can go online at, your usual places that you do and get the book. So I'd say the book is a great first tangible resource, but I'd love to show up and support for people. So just signing up at lisakeefauver.com/newsletter, you will be able to find me. And of course, you can listen to my show where you listen to this show too, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all your favorite places. And as I mentioned, I'm launching season 6 in just a few weeks. Yeah.
Most podcasts don't make it past 30 episodes, so well done on that.
Yeah, I am. It's the first thing I did when I shifted my work towards specializing in grief, because I was a big podcast consumer and I knew it was like the right place to be. And it's my heart, really. I mean, I love everything that I get to do. And as you heard, I have quite a diversity of things that I get to do, but my podcast, just one of my favorite things to do.
All right, we'll wrap up with one last question then.
Yeah.
You've got a bunch of diverse interests. You've actually been a scuba diver since you were 12.
Yes.
During the podcast today, you've said the word wave, you've said the word gulf, so everything kind of ties in together to that.
Always, yeah.
What are some of the lessons, I'm going to put you on the spot, from diving that have impacted your life and your work, and how have those lessons shaped your approach to grief and resilience?
Yeah. Well, you're not putting me on the spot at all, actually, because this is a sustained meditation I've had for a long time. And I actually wrote a piece on this years ago that ended up in my book. Ariana Huffington shared it with her Thrive community too as well. This is the lesson I learned as a 12-year-old scuba diver, that I didn't really understand the third component to it until I was holding my husband in my arms as he died, which is dive in, breathe deep, and buddy breathe when necessary. Okay, that's what we need to know about life, and that's what we need to know about navigating loss. The dive in and breathe deep part is just start close in. Start with what you know. Take that first step, not the right step or the perfect step, just that step. Breathe deep is just really a reminder to always practice mindfulness. We experience grief at the physiological nervous system level. So extended exhalations or whatever kind of breath practice you can go to, keep it simple. Inhale for 3, exhale for 6, something simple. Gets you in a regulated state so that you can feel clear enough to make that next step. And the third part, which is hard for so many of us for lots of reasons, definitely is hard for me as a professional helper and growing up in the family that I grew up in, which is buddy breathe when necessary. In diving, you never dive alone. You always dive with a buddy. And that's in case you run out of air, your dive buddy takes their regulator and shares it back and forth. We are not meant to navigate grief alone. This is a modernity issue. We live separate, that we live disconnected, the capitalism and modernity. We are meant to hold space and bear witness for one another, which means that buddy breathing part is necessary, whether that's a friend, whether that's a grief guide like myself, whether that's a support group or a community, whatever it is, reach out for help. So buddy breathing is necessary. And remember, sometimes you're the one asking for help, right? Or needing the air. And sometimes you're the one offering air. And the more we actually ask for help, the more we give the people in our lives permission to do the same when it's their turn, because we're all going to take a turn needing help.
Lisa, this has been great. Can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us today. For listeners who want to dive deeper into Lisa's work, again, please be sure to check out her podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, and her new book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss. You can also go to the website, reimagininggrief.com. I'm going to say Grief is a Sneaky Bitch one more time to get that tally up.
Thank you.
Lisa, I appreciate you.
Thank you, Adam, so much for the conversation. I so appreciate being with like-minded people who want to talk about these important things.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Buried in Work podcast. Remember, you can save 10% on our estate preparation package and games with code podcast10 at buriedinwork.com.